Welcome to our brand new show, The Islamic Dilemma. I am your host, Al Fadi. Joining me here today, my special guest, Bill Warner. Welcome, Bill.
Delighted to be here.
As we mentioned to you in our previous episode, that the intent behind our program is to basically provide our viewers, especially the non-Arabic speakers, with an in-depth analysis of the teachings of Islam, its doctrines, the Qur'an, and all of the other sources that Islam basically relies upon. Wouldn't you agree, Bill?
Yes, and I think our viewers will find it is a fascinating subject.
Absolutely. Well, last time we gave an overview of a variety of topics, but today I am pleased to tell you that we are going to start a series of episodes that will analyze the Quran more in depth. Now, some people like you, Bill, for instance, have studied the Quran intensively, and you have done some analyses about that. Would you be willing to tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I'm a scientist, so my approach to the Quran is that it's data. It's just information, text, words on a page. So this gives me a dispassionate view. I approach it as neither belief nor disbelief, just in the same way you would to me, this is a laboratory experiment. And so, therefore, I'm interested in, my first thing that I was interested in was get it to make sense. You know, everybody's confused. And so I began to, as I sorted things out, as we've mentioned earlier, I began to realize that there was an early Quran and a later Quran. But now when you look in the book, they don't tell you that.
Right, and let's explain to our viewer what that means. Basically, the early Quran that Bill is referring to is what is called the Meccan Quran. It's called Meccan Quran simply because it was revealed in Mecca. That's the name of the town where Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, started his mission as a prophet. That's roughly started between 610 AD to around 622 AD, at which point, basically, Muhammad decided that he wants to move now north to another
Well, now the Meccans helped persuade him.
That's, yeah, that's true. I mean, there was some persuasion, of course. I mean, his major claim was that his immigration actually had to do with a threat against his life. Now, whether that's true or not is yet to be determined. Now, when he moved to Medina, that's what we call the second Quran.
Yes.
Now, can you help us, Bill, understand why you called it the second Quran? What was the difference between the two, for instance?
Well, the difference is quite startling. When you start off in Mecca, some of the first revelations could almost be called hymns to God, and quite religious. But then when you get to Medina, it reads like a law text. I mean, literally like a law text, or sometimes a military text. But it's quite different. It's not so religious at all.
And that is true. And I want to remind our viewers, by the way, that you cannot just open the Quran and, you know, you can immediately tell which part was in Mecca and which part was in Medina. Actually, all of the chapters in the Quran are commingled together, and you really have to search hard to find which one belongs to which period. I mean, ironically, sometimes even portions of a chapter belong to one period and the other portion belongs to another. Sometimes a whole chapter belongs to Mecca and only one verse belongs to Medina and vice versa. So you can understand now why it is so important for us to have a show like this and at the same time to be able to explain things like this to you also in these episodes in depth. In fact, I also recommend my viewers to go to my blog, thequrandilemma.com, or our website, thequran.com, and you can purchase our book, The Quran Dilemma, and in there we have done enough analyses about all of these topics that we have covered and we will continue to cover as well. Now, Bill, here is a question. Is the Quran, from your own study, a book of terror or is it a book of peace?
The answer is yes.
Yes to both.
Yes to both.
And that is true. In fact, I would like to show our viewers a sample of some of these difficulties or even contradictions between one verse that will talk peacefully about others and another verse, for instance, that will talk a jihadist language, if we wish, against people in general. I would direct your attention now to the monitor. We have a verse and it's found in the Quran, chapter 49, verse 13. And as you can read here, it says, all mankind. So it's talking to all people, basically. The we is reference to the God of Islam. His name is Allah. So Allah is saying, we created you from a single pair, meaning the reference to Adam and Eve, a male and female, and made you into nations, which is basically you grew into tribes and nations as we have today. And then that you may know each other, basically, and verily the most honored of you in the sight of God is basically the righteous one. So the only distinction here in the sight of God when he judges you is basically who is righteous and who is not. I mean, you look at this verse and there is nothing whatsoever that is alarming about something like this. Now what's so alarming is when we discover that this particular verse, and I'm going to mention another verse that my Muslim friends always like to cite, and it's found in chapter 2, verse 256, for instance, and it says, no compulsion in religion. In other words, they try to convince you and convince me and convince people that really Islam is a religion that does not compel people to accept it as a religion. Well, if that's the case, let us take a look, for instance, at the following verse that comes after this slide. In this particular slide, we read something that is really alarming. In fact, the very beginning of it says, slay the idolaters. This verse found in chapter 9, verse 5. And it says, slay the idolaters. Who are the idolaters? Those who do not worship the God of Islam. In fact, Christians and Jews are considered idolaters. According to the same chapter 9, verse 28, it says that the Christians basically worship Jesus as the Son of God. Therefore, they're idolaters because they're worshiping someone else beside God. And it makes a false claim against the Jews by stating that the Jews are also idolaters because they worship supposedly someone by the name Ezra. Whether Ezra is actually the prophet Ezra that is mentioned in the Old Testament or someone else, we cannot find any tangible evidence to support such a claim. And let's assume, just assume, that indeed there was a group of Jewish people who worshipped someone by the name Ezra. The Quran, in its language that it's used in that particular verse, actually generalized this against all Jews, calling all of them idolaters. And that's really what's so troubling. But let's go back again to this particular one that we are watching on the screen right now. Chapter 9, verse 5, it says, slay the idolaters wherever you find them, and take them captives, and besiege them, and lie in wait for them in every ambush. Bill, does this sound peaceful to you right now?
I'm not comfortable. I'm not comfortable. There's people here that want to take me captive. They're waiting to ambush me. This sounds like Delta Force. Or the Marines.
Now, once again, our friends who are the Muslim people will tell us that actually you have to read this verse within its context. Now, you studied the Quran. What were the context of this chapter, for instance? Was there a specific event that you can take this verse and say, well, it applied 1400 years ago, it doesn't apply today?
Well, you and I are going to let them in on a secret, which is this is the final chapter of the Quran. Even though it says 9, and there's 114 chapters, this is the concluding chapter. This is the wrap-up, the final thing. And all of a sudden I find that because I'm who I am, I can be slain for being who I am sitting here. That's all that's needed.
And indeed, we're going to show even more evidence behind that. Did you know that this verse, Bill, is called the sword verse?
Yes, the infamous sword verse.
Exactly. Now, why would we call something like this the sword verse if Quran is actually a book of peace? In fact, I want to fill my viewers on something that is very important. There is something called the doctrine of abrogation. In other words, the doctrine of cancellation. What does that mean? I mean, Bill, you've studied also again this. Can you tell our viewers, for instance, your understanding of the doctrine of abrogation?
Well, first off, the doctrine of abrogation comes from the very Quran itself.
True.
The Arabs of the time of Muhammad were not stupid, all right? And so they listened to his revelations. And then finally they go, Muhammad, you said something earlier that was different from this. Now you're supposed to be getting this from God. Surely God knows his own mind. What is the problem here? And of course, they were also on Muhammad in another way, which was, if this is God, why didn't he just give you the whole thing all at once? What is this dribble business? And then as we watch it dribbling out of you, you change things. And so he was confronted with these questions. Why are you changing it?
That is very true, and we are going to discuss this doctrine in a later episode in more depth, because it's a very crucial doctrine that basically, in my mind, it is the doctrine that distinguishes between what we call moderate Muslims and radical Muslims. In fact, the radicals actually, in my view, are the true followers of Islam.
I would agree. But let's return for a moment. I think if we will look at any serious scholarly work on the Qur'an that deals with trying to explain the Qur'an, the first thing they will say to you is, until you understand abrogation, you cannot understand the Qur'an. That's how central this is. This is not just some minor problem. This is the very backbone of the Qur'an.
Absolutely, and ladies and gentlemen, we're not talking about one verse only, but this is a verse that I used as an example. In fact, I used this particular one because of its name. The nickname is the sword verse, and in fact, some of the studies that we have done prove that this verse have abrogated anywhere from 111 peaceful verses all the way to 124 peaceful verses. Now that's a big difference here, as if you're taking 111 verses or 117 or 124 and you're just throwing them out. Basically, they're canceled.
They're gone.
So what you have to live by now is a command like this. Now, if you are, Bill, a true follower of the Quran and Islam, what does this verse mean to you?
Well, we know from the doctrine of abrogation that this verse is, by Allah's own word, better, stronger. So if I'm going to be a stronger Muslim, I need to be following this verse about slaying the idolaters, not this earlier part, which is humanity's one spirit. So the humanity is one spirit, according to the Quran itself, is a weak statement, and the latter verse is stronger.
In other words, basically, the God of Islam will decide later that he wants to issue a new command. And this new command will go ahead and cancel whatever commands came before it.
I call the earlier verse the kitten verse and the later verse the tiger verse.
that's a funny way of looking at it.
Well, it's kind of, we can see in here an evolution. We start off because Muhammad is in Mecca and he's a peaceful man. And then when he gets his full dose of Allah, he becomes a tiger. He's now a full-grown, mature Muslim. So this verse 9, or chapter 9, is the mature, fully developed, complete Muslim. The earlier one is the kitten phase, not yet full.
Right. I want to also add to this discussion, not many people know that, for instance, every single chapter in the Quran starts with a very infamous phrase, in the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate, except chapter 9.
Precisely.
And when you study the chapter 9 reason behind why this, what they call Basmala, because in Arabic it's Bismillah, why is it missing? One of the reasons is this chapter deals with idolaters, and the Basmala